Hello, everyone. This is Eva Nolik-Smith with YogaUOnline. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this talk with yoga therapist Doug Keller. Doug is the author of Therapeutic Wisdom of Yoga, one of the most comprehensive books on the structural aspects of yoga therapy. And he's also the author of a number of other highly regarded books on the practice of yoga. Doug is a widely sought after workshop presenter pretty much all over the world, right, Doug?
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. And I think, Doug, one of the things that makes you unique and the reason that you're so popular is that, at least in my opinion, Doug is really like a yogi scientist because he combines a lifelong study of hatha yoga in both the Iyengar and Ashtanga yoga system with really in-depth research into Western science relating to anatomy and physiology of the human body. And Doug's ability to synthesize these two traditions into a greater whole is really the hallmark of his teaching, and one that makes him what we would consider a true leader in bringing the teaching of yoga and yoga therapy to a whole new level of excellence. So Doug, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Today.
Glad to be here.
And I'm just curious to begin with, how did you get into the specific angle that characterizes your work, which is this keen interest and expertise in Western science of anatomy and physical therapy, and then this integration of that with the knowledge of yoga? How did that develop over the years?
Well, I certainly started out with the hatha yoga practice and with the Iyengar background and some practice in Ashtanga. And then with the development of the Anusara system that started to develop the principles in a way that emphasized both simplicity, but also addressing therapeutic problems. And I also found to be a teacher, I needed more than the simple principles, because as a teacher, I have to recognize the differences between students and what kind of actions benefit them. And so I wanted to look more deeply into developing those abilities for working with students. And at the time, I was introduced to all of the fascia work that was being done both by Tom Myers and by other people. And that seemed to offer a rationale that was more evidence-based and was useful to people, both for understanding therapeutic problems that come up in the body and a way of understanding the body as a whole, because often when people have a therapeutic problem, a therapist or a doctor will just look at the specific area of the body where the person experiences pain, but not take into account what's happening overall in terms of the posture, how the person's moves, what the movement patterns are. And even then, people need a kind of practice to follow so they can connect with their own body and recognize when they're doing things that cause the pain, and also have a practice they can follow to relieve the pain. And the hatha yoga practice offers a good context for that. It gives something fuller to do than simply a few remedial exercises to work with it. And so with all the fascial research, that to me gave a really good connection between the kind of metaphorical terminology or experiential terminology that yogas uses, talking about prana, flow of prana, even they say flow of prana. Sometimes today we say flow of energy, which people have a problem with because they don't understand what that means.
Right.
But once they're introduced to what it feels like when the fascia, the quality of the fascia changes in the body, then they start to understand more what that flow of prana means or what it feels like. So it made a good connection between the essence of the yoga tradition, especially working with prana, and a more concrete, tangible understanding of what that means, how to work with that, how to improve it through asana practice, with an understanding that asana is much more than simply seeking flexibility or even just strength and flexibility. It's also, in the contemporary terminology, we talk about fascial fitness, which is actually a good way of expressing it. I guess in a sense, the yogis were always looking for pranic fitness with all the exercises they did, not just with the body itself, but also with the breath. I mean, the pranayama practice itself was a form, in an interesting sense, of creating fascial fitness in the body. So it
Mhm.
just makes a lot of connections that people can relate to, because it's not always easy for people to relate to yogic terminology, though it sounds intriguing. It doesn't necessarily communicate enough for them to understand how to work with it.
Yeah, yeah. And you started with fascia, but then from there you kind of took a deep dive into some of the leading thinkers within physical therapy, like Shirley Sarman and other great pioneers in the physical therapy
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah. Shirley Sarman, certainly Eric Dalton does a lot as a massage therapist. He does a lot of good work with identifying
Yeah,
specific therapeutic problems. Also with people that are in sports or otherwise healthy and functional when pain problems come up, because often we think of therapy just in terms of people that are sick or disabled or not able to move, but a lot of problems come up for people that are relatively healthy
right,
and active, and they need help too.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, speaking of problems that come up, I'm going to segue into the main topic of our talk. We're here to focus mainly
Yeah.
on the hamstrings, which is sort of like some would call them the bad boy muscle group. I don't know if I want to go quite that far, but it's certain, I think, is safe to say that we ignore the hamstrings, particularly if we practice yoga regularly. We ignore the hamstrings at our own peril. So tell us about the hamstrings and what they are and why they're so important to yoga practitioners.
Well, they're certainly one of the most biggest workhorse muscles in the body, along with the thigh muscles at the front, because the hamstrings help to hold up our posture and keep us upright. And they're not meant to be working all the time. And when we have postural imbalances or bad postural patterns, it tends to put a lot more stress on the hamstring. And the effect is it puts a lot of pressure on the lower back. So a lot of lower back and sacral problems are related to what's going on in the hamstring, whether they're actually different forms of tightness depending on your postural pattern. And since one of the actions that we do most often beyond simply standing up is we bend forward, and that puts stress upon the hamstrings, whether you do yoga or not. And this is where people experience injuries in the hamstrings, up around the sit bones, or going up into the sacrum and into the lower back. So healthy hamstrings are key to a healthy lower back. And of course, it's a main part of yoga practice is to maintain the flexibility of the hamstrings. Sometimes it's overemphasized too much to be flexible in the hamstrings because they're also meant to be strong to support us. And if we overly weaken the hamstrings by overstretching them, that affects our knees as well as our lower back.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a key muscle just for maintaining the basic health of the body and the most normal functional movements that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to work well with them. And we often become too aggressive in working with them, trying to stretch them too aggressively when they're tight, or even when people get more capable of being flexible, they even kind of bypass the hamstrings in a way that starts to cause problems later,
Yeah,
just for
yeah,
the sake of doing flexible poses.
yeah. Just sort of like as a rough estimate from the classes I teach, I would say, if you get a group of people, particularly over 45 or so, close to 50% will have tight hamstrings. And I think, if we start with the effects of tight hamstrings, number one issue is injuries, right? We had a
Yeah.
guy, one of our friends in his like late 50s or so, we took him out to learn to play pickleball. And he was having the greatest time of his life. He loved it. And then he had a fall. And it wasn't like a huge fall, but he tore his hamstrings. His hamstrings snapped. And, I've had other people that you play with, they fall and it's no big deal. So, but he had, hamstrings torn really badly, swollen legs, and had to do physical therapy and recover for 6 weeks. So what's the difference there, like the people who fall and there's no big deal, and people who are likely to get injured when they fall?
Well, certainly if people go from inactivity to sudden activity, that's often where we pull muscles, especially when you take up something you haven't done in a long time and you jump into it with both feet. The whole weekend warrior problem, where people work during the week and then they get really active during the weekend, and the hamstrings aren't quite prepared for it, along with other muscles. And I was thinking while you're talking too, there's some, I mean, there are a number of muscles in the body that are very connected to our state of mind and even state of emotion. And certainly the hamstrings reflect, even tightness in the hamstrings can reflect the activity of the mind. Sometimes the overactivity, or, you know, metaphorically, the very tightness of the mind shows up in the tightness in the hamstrings. When we're concerned about something or stressed about something, it shows up as tightness in the rest of the body. Also connected to the feet, because when there's fatigue in the feet, when the arches start to tire, that tightens up the hamstrings as well as the lower back. And also even postural positions like the forward head position. If you sit long enough at the computer staring forward into the screen, not only does your back start to tighten up, but your hamstrings do. And again, if you jump up from the computer and go out to do something like take a run, you might end up pulling it because they got so tight, both from sitting and from concentrating on your work. Because they do have these studies where they, you know, they checked out people under anesthesia to check out what their flexibility is under anesthesia. Our hamstrings are quite flexible when we're under anesthesia, but the minute we wake up, all of a sudden they're horribly tight. So we have to take into account the mind-body connection and how we're relating to the hamstrings mentally. Often we treat it as just something separate from us that we're supposed to stretch, like, well, this is my body, I'm trying to stretch, when really it's so deeply affected by the mind and even the aggressiveness of the mind towards the body or other attitudes, all of which are important. So it's a good opportunity to connect into the body.
Yeah. And so it's fair to say that if we do have tight hamstrings, we will be much more likely to have some kind of serious injury if we play.
You're more likely to tear or pull them. We're going to be talking both about tightness in the hamstrings, which arise from different factors like the pelvic tilt and other things I've been mentioning, but also when somebody has a forward pelvic tilt or is very flexible or arched in the back and otherwise flexible in the inner hamstrings, certain aspects of the hamstrings, the outer hamstrings, actually tighten up to help stabilize the pelvis when the pelvis is unstable. So we run into this paradox that as people get more flexible in the main aspects of forward bending, there are aspects of the hamstrings that tighten up to try to stabilize the sacrum. So you can be both flexible in the hamstrings in one way and tight in another way. And that's most often, and that's most often where flexible people end up pulling their hamstring attachments even more often than inflexible people. So inflexible people might feel the pain around the knee or the middle of the hamstring and maybe up a little bit around the top, but it's the flexible people that have this hamstring attachment and injury, which is one of the most common injuries in yoga, along with shoulder stuff that comes with this development. And even in connection with fascia, I was reviewing something over the weekend while I was teaching, and they were pointing out that because the hamstrings are made up of a lot of hard connective tissue to make it a supportive muscle that supports posture, which means there's a lot of collagen in the muscle to make it stiff and structural. And when we develop too much stiffness in the fascia, it does interfere with our whole sense of what's called interoception. There's proprioception, which is your sense of where the body is in space and how the joints are moving. Interoception is about being in contact with how you feel inside. You see somebody and say, how are you doing today? And they say, well, I'm doing good, or I'm not doing so well. I feel light, I feel heavy. That's an active interoception. You check inside and check into how you're feeling. And the hamstrings are a place where we can get so tight that we actually don't know so clearly how we're doing inside. It kind of cuts off that connection to the body. And so working with the hamstrings is reestablishing the connection with the body, not just
Mhm.
physically, but even emotionally connecting to the messages we get from the body, how we're feeling
Mm.
emotionally inside or what's going on.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's you know, you can really make the connection uh, between yoga and making an emotional connection with the body through the medium of the fascia as we come to understand it. So
Mm.
it's one of the important muscles to connect with.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, the psoas is another muscle like that, but it's so deep and subtle that it's much harder to relate to what's going on with the psoas, except that we get back pain when it's tight or so on and so forth.
Right. Right.
A lot of people talk about the psoas emotion connection, but there's a lot to be said for the hamstring emotion connection and seeing how
Interesting.
that's kind of like inner work that you're doing.
The tightness in the fascia.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes the
Yeah.
disconnection shows up as flexibility, which can also lead to pain just as much as inflexibility. So they're both important.
Yeah. Well, one point along the lines of the connection between emotions and the hamstrings and the mind and the hamstrings is I've noticed hamstring stretches like Supta Padangusthasana is the best possible sleep remedy at
Yeah,
night.
yeah,
You know, if you can't sleep, go into Supta Padangusthasana for 10, 15
yeah,
minutes and you're good to go.
yeah.
So they have
I
it,
think it's going to be a theme in the course. Definitely, that's one of the key stretches for working with the hamstrings, and it's definitely going to be a part of the practice as well as the lecture. And we also have the concept that to stretch the hamstring, you just like put a belt around your foot and pull on the leg to make it more flexible.
right.
When a good part of the tightness that we experience in muscles, especially the hamstring, is because the hamstrings are not just one muscle, it's a set of basically three muscles with the little submuscles in it. And the fascia between these muscles are meant to allow the muscles to be able to slide independently of each other, because they also control how we rotate the leg. And what we experience as tightness in the hamstrings is often the fascia itself gets somewhat dehydrated and sticky. And
Mm,
so the muscles get stuck together and don't slide so much. And we
mm,
experience that as that kind of sore pulling in the muscle. So
mhm,
a good approach to hamstring stretching is to start out dynamically working with bending and straightening the leg while placing it in a stretch position. And as the fascia starts to get more slippery and liquid and hydrated, then you can get deeper into stretching the muscle itself. But if
mm,
we just think, you know, it's like you see runners just put their leg up on a park bench,
right.
bounce on the muscle to try to stretch it
Yeah,
out. The muscle reacts by tightening up because
right,
fascially it just becomes more rigid. So we need
right.
kind of fluid movement to start to release the hamstring, then we
Yeah.
can get deeper into stretching it.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point because one of the things I've noticed, despite having, you know, a daily yoga practice, you know, of an hour or so every day, with age over time, as you get into your 60s, your hamstrings still get tighter.
Yeah,
So, but you're telling me it's not really my hamstring, it's my fascia drying out,
yeah, it's
which
the
I
whole
can
fascial
totally relate
system.
to. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
Especially if when there's less movement, that's when the fascia gets really sticky. So
Yeah,
I mean, the
because I just
first,
go into a forward bend and they're like, nope, we don't want to do that.
it's like don't want to do it. Yeah, and it's often the case with older people; they become less active than they were when they were younger. And of
Mhm.
course, the yoga practice is an opportunity to stay active. We don't
Right,
realize often how sedentary we might be becoming,
right,
and that's happening in the fascia because you're not necessarily doing anything that makes the hamstrings tighter,
right.
though posture affects that, but still they're getting tighter because the fascia is getting tighter. So it needs to move in
Yeah,
order to keep that kind of liquidity to it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very interesting. I want to get back to the pelvic tilt discussion because you sort
Yeah.
of packed in a few sentences, which was really like a 3-hour lecture to completely
Hmm.
understand what you said.
Yeah.
So if we just start with the basics, hamstrings, particularly tight hamstrings, affect yoga postures and alignment in yoga postures in a gazillion ways, particularly by virtue of pelvic tilt.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit more about that and what that means for our yoga
In
practice.
a simple sense, I mean, one kind of pelvic tilt is people that have their pelvis tucked under. And you see that they have less of a curve in their back, or the back tends to be more flat, or you can actually see the posture is a little bit rounded in the lower back. And that are not only pulls on and weakens the lower back, it also causes the hamstrings around the sit bones and the upper hamstrings to tighten up a little bit. And sometimes in the extreme cases of tucked pelvis, you see people actually walk around with the knees slightly flexed or bent, and they never fully straighten the legs, and the hamstrings are tightening up to help support the lower back. So that's the hamstrings start to replace the lower back muscles for postural stability. And so an actual interesting key to overcoming that dynamic is you start to work in a way that strengthens the lower back. And as the lower back gets a little bit stronger, the hamstrings release because they don't have to work so hard. And so it becomes more of a balance between upper and lower, and both muscles achieve better tone. The opposite is the person with the very curved back, or the lordotic back, the back that's arched inwards very strongly. And this is the forward tilt to the pelvis. And in that case, the lower back muscles are actually tightened up to hold that forward tilt. And the effect is that actually causes the hamstrings at the sit bones to release. So the lower back muscles are doing all the work of supporting the postures. So the hamstrings, especially in the upper part, start to just go to sleep a little bit until you bend forward. And then you've got the whole weight of the body tipping forward into the forward bend. And it's sort of like doing a little bungee jump off of a bridge. At first you bend forward easily, and at the very end, the hamstrings pull up tight to kind of stop you from falling on your head. So it's that sudden jerk of the bungee cord at the end that tears the hamstring around the sit bones. And also posturally, like I was saying, part of the hamstrings, the outer hamstrings, stay a little bit tighter as kind of like a structural support against the forward tilt to the pelvis. And you don't really feel it until you bend forward deeply, and then it starts to pull. And in seated forward bends especially, you see the people with a forward tilted pelvis, their legs kind of turn in as they go deeply into the forward bend. And the tighter people that show up in yoga class, they try to do a forward bend. Their back is rounded, and you also see their legs turn out a lot from the pull of the hamstrings as well as the adductors. And so the seated forward bends in particular are trying to find the balance between not turning in too much, not turning out too much, having the knees, the toes pointing straight upwards, and then stretching in a balanced way. And part of the practice in the lecture is to find techniques for the people with a tucked pelvis to make their lower back a little bit stronger, to get the pelvis to tilt first before you try to get into stretching the hamstrings. And then for the more flexible people that tilt forward too easily, how do you create a little bit of tone in the muscles to restrain you from that sort of bungee jump approach to doing a forward bend, where you just flop into it and then hurt at the end?
Yeah. So that injury or issue that's very common in yoga practitioner, which is the strain at the insertion point of the hamstrings, which people feel as a kind of tenderness by the sits bones where the hamstrings attach. So you're saying that issue, is it related in general to people with flexible hamstrings, or is it only for people who have an anterior pelvic tilt with a lordotic curve?
Yeah, both people experience it in a different way, both flexible and inflexible. And the simplest way to put it is the person with the tucked pelvis experiences tightness around the sit bones, but where it really starts to hurt is around the lower back and the sacrum, about the level of the belt at the back. So when they tip forward, they round the back and it starts to pull on their lower back, and they feel a pulling in the upper hamstring, but they really feel that pulling in the lower back as well. And the person who has the very forward tilted pelvis doesn't necessarily feel, well, won't feel a pulling in the lower back, but will feel a much stronger pulling at the sit bones particularly when they go into a forward bend. They don't necessarily feel it when they're
Yeah.
standing up.
Yeah.
But of course, forward bending is something we do all day long, just bending over to pick
Right.
something up, sitting in a chair. And so
Yeah.
it builds up like death by a thousand cuts, you
Yeah.
know, little pulls, and after a while it just starts to hurt.
Yeah.
And then especially you go to yoga class and you do something and that just triggers an injury that was already developing.
Right. Right.
So we're
And
trying to create balance.
what about people who don't have an anterior pelvic tilt but lose hamstrings? Is that also an issue with the bungee cord jumping pull on the hamstring insertion?
It depends on how they do the forward bend. So you could have somebody with a relatively neutral pelvis.
Mm-hmm.
And what came to be current in yoga was because so many people are tight, the teachers would tell a student to do a swan dive or arch your back. You know,
Right.
and generally you say come forward with a straight spine, but
Yeah.
often they overemphasize and say arch the back some more,
Right.
which is not by itself necessarily a bad instruction. We're going to add some modifications to it. But
Uh-huh.
then as people get better at arching the back, they start to get too good at it. So even as they're
Mm.
standing up and they have a neutral tilt, the minute they go into a forward bend, they do it as if they're one of these lordotic people. And it's
Right.
that action going into the forward bend that pulls it at the end. So you can't always guess by looking at a person's posture what
Right. Right.
happens in the hamstring. You have to look at how they actually go into the forward bend.
Oh, wow.
We'll look at those kind of tendencies. And there are some simple little hacks that you can do that restrain people from doing too much of one or the other action. So they
Uh-huh.
move in a more balanced way. And we're basically looking for everybody to feel the stretch more in the middle of the hamstring instead of at the joint, instead of
Right.
at the sit bone. And many people, especially people that are runners or active in different ways, like in sports, experience pain around the knees because of the hamstrings as well,
Mm.
because the hamstrings cover both the sit bones and the knees and affect both
Right.
joints.
Right. Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
approach to it is relatively simple. It just takes the patience to remind yourself not to drop into your old habits and find a
Right.
new pattern that
Yeah.
localizes the stretch better for you.
Yeah. Yeah. You also said earlier that overstretching the hamstrings can lead to problems. Do you want to talk about that and why
Yeah,
that is?
basically, I mean, the hamstring along with the calf muscle are actually the muscles at the back of the knee that stabilize the knee
Mm-hmm.
because they both act to bend the knee, but also when you straighten the leg, it's the hamstrings and the calves that stop the knees from locking or hyperextending backwards,
Mm-hmm.
along with the ligaments.
Mm.
Uh, and the most common pattern we'll mention for hyperextension are people that tend to stand with their hips shifted forward and they have that tucked
Mm.
pelvis, which makes
Sway
the
back
hamstrings tight at the sit bones.
right.
Hamstrings are tight at the sit bones, but that makes the hamstrings loosen up at the other end, and then they're more likely to not lock the knees back.
Mm.
That's the whole thing we got into in the webinar on the knees, and I'll touch upon it here just to show how, first of all, if your hamstrings are tight, we can actually use our hamstrings to stretch our hamstrings.
Mm.
So when you activate the hamstrings in one way, it actually allows you to bend forward more easily. At the same time, we need to keep the hamstrings a little bit strong as well as flexible. So the very exercises we do to stretch the hamstrings also involve a strengthening that keeps the knees more stable,
Mm.
because otherwise we get into the habit of locking the knees.
Mm.
And it becomes a double whammy where the person in the forward bend that pulls the hamstrings also locks the knees back and then does an injustice to the knees and the hamstring attachments at the same time.
Right. Right.
And overall, you know, teachers say to have a micro bend in the knees just so people don't lock the knees. That does help. But
Right.
we'll add a couple little elements to that just to help keep the knees stable as you work with that forward bending.
Right. Right. And I wonder, last question, just how strong the tight hamstring back pain connection is. The traditional way of describing it is, you know, tight hamstrings pull the pelvis under, you have a posterior pelvic tilt, which then in turn puts strain on the low back, as you were talking about earlier. So how well documented is this connection? I mean, my stepson has very tight hamstrings and chronic lower back pain, and I keep telling him to stretch his hamstrings, and he keeps saying, "You don't know what you're talking about." So I
Well,
wonder just
the
how strong
connection,
the connection is.
it's been pretty well understood for a long time, and some of the books go into, I'll mention one book in the webinar that kind of shows that connection between the two in terms of studies and facts. But a simpler way to think of it is the tilt of the pelvis is controlled by the muscles on either side of the pelvis. Just thinking of the back body, the muscles of the lower back pull upwards to help tilt the pelvis forward, and the hamstrings and the gluteals pull downwards to tilt the pelvis backwards. And it's sort of like if you build a bridge, you got cables on both sides of the bridge that hold it up. And if you tighten up the cables too much on one side and loosen the others, it starts to tilt over or go sideways. So we're finding that balance between the back muscles pulling up both to maintain the curve in the back and to keep the pelvis in a neutral tilt, and the hamstrings and the gluteals pulling downwards in the opposite direction. So as they modulate back and forth, when you bend forward, the hamstrings release as the back muscles activate more. And in the back bend, the gluteals and the hamstrings are involved in pulling the pelvis backwards, so you're not just using your lower back muscles. So along with telling people to stretch their hamstrings when they're tight, also we have to look at strengthening the lower back, because otherwise we don't have that opposing pull, and the hamstrings just don't want to let go because they're trying to hold the pelvis steady for you. And if you don't give them some help from above, they just, again, physiologically, they just don't want to let go, because they're like, if we do, you're going to fall on your head.
Yeah.
You know, so fascially and neurologically, they just kind of hold on a little bit.
Yeah. So when you say strengthen the lower back, quadratus lumborum, or what are you?
Yeah, all of the erector spinae, the multifidus muscles, we'll talk about the connect to the sacrum, all of them. It actually starts with a little forward tilt to the sacrum. We did the whole webinar on the sacrum, and we'll kind of touch upon those points. So as much as we talk about pelvic tilt, it starts with the sacrum tipping forward, and then that puts the pelvis in a position, or that affects the pelvis in a way that finds a neutral tilt. And so if you're kind of sitting back into your sacrum, it causes this pelvis to tilt backwards. If you're arching too much in the sacrum, that starts to cause the pelvis to tilt forward. And so it's the spinal muscles in that sense, which again are relatively easy to work with. It just takes getting used to getting out of our habits. For instance, the tight person, the first thing they do is they reach for their feet to try to grab the feet and pull on them, or pull on a belt. And the minute you reach forward to grab the belt, your lower back doesn't have any support anymore. Your lower back weakens, the person rounds backwards, and now they're just fighting with themselves because they're not holding the spine up enough. And the harder they pull on the belt, they're not doing a forward bend. It's more like they're doing a sit-up. And the more they try to bend forward in the lower back, the more it just weakens the back. And again, hamstrings are like, we need help here. And then they just start to tighten up because they're getting no help. So we can think of the lower back as being the support group for the hamstrings. Make them a little bit stronger, then the hamstrings can relax a little bit. You know?
Talk to therapy for the hamstrings.
Yeah, and vice versa. The hamstrings are a support group for the lower back muscles when they tend to be overly ambitious or overly active.
Wonderful. Well, Doug, thank you so much. This was extremely interesting. And as always, you know, just 3 little muscles and so much to do, or so much to know. You know, it's unbelievable. And I think so important that we understand this, because no matter what stage you're at in your yoga practice, the body is always changing and the parameters are always changing. So like in my case, and like, wait, my hamstrings have always been flexible. Why are they getting tight? like understanding those dynamics, and I
Yeah.
got some good insights into what it is I could do differently to, you know, work with the changes in my body. And it's just so wonderful to have an authority like you who's taken the time to
Thank you.
read up on all of this and give us.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly like you're saying, the hamstrings are like at the epicenter of the changes that take place in our body as we progressively age. And they're almost like the canary in the mine shaft telling us the ways in which we're tightening up, because we start to feel it there on the lower back first. And we can work with that. I mean, my favorite sutra from Patanjali is always the one where he says, the pain which is yet to come can be avoided. So if you pay attention to your hamstrings, the pain which is yet to come can be avoided.
Yes, yes, he was the pioneer of all things prevention. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and we very much look forward to joining you for the course. And everyone listening in, if you have questions for Doug that you want him to cover in the course, if you join us for the course, do send them to us at support@YogaUOnline.com, and we can make sure Doug addresses your question in the course as well. So Doug, thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thanks. I look forward to it.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.